Listen carefully, because once I speak these words, you'll never see the world the same way again. On a cold December night in 1891, in the backwoods of Tennessee, an entire lineage was erased from existence. Not by disease, not by fire, not even by war, but by something far older, far hungrier, and far more deliberate. 19 children of the Blackwell family vanished in a single night. No bodies, no graves, no answers. If you dare to face the truth behind this story, hit that subscribe button now and press the bell icon, because the next revelation should reach you before anyone else. The townspeople whispered about wolves. Others muttered about raiders from the hills. But those who truly lived close to the soil, those who understood the language of the wind through the trees, knew better. They spoke only in hushed tones, and never after dark. Because what happened that night was not an accident of nature, but an invocation. Picture it. The Blackwell farmhouse, isolated on a ridge, surrounded by skeletal trees clawing at a winter sky. Oil lamps flickering, shadows crawling across wooden walls. Inside, children huddled together, 19 souls bound by blood and fate. A family rooted in old-world superstitions they never should have brought with them from across the ocean. And then, silence. Not a scream, not a struggle. By dawn, every cradle lay empty, every bed cold, every corner of the farmhouse untouched, except for the symbols carved into the beams. Symbols that no farmer's hand would know. Symbols of binding, of sacrifice, of a pact older than the nation itself. The sheriff's men combed the forest. Bloodhounds refused to enter. Tracks in the snow led nowhere, vanishing as if the earth had swallowed them whole. No graves, no ransom, no sound, just a silence that weighed on the land like a curse. And here's the truth the newspapers never printed. The Blackwells were not victims. They were participants. For years, whispers trailed them, secret gatherings, forbidden rites, a hunger to bind their bloodline to something beyond human. The disappearance of the children was not the breaking of their covenant, but the fulfillment of it. You were never supposed to know this. You were supposed to believe it was a mystery, a tragedy, a footnote in forgotten Tennessee history. But it wasn't. It was a ritual. And tonight, as you hear these words, you'll understand why that ritual was never meant to be uncovered. The night the Blackwell children vanished was not the end of something. It was the beginning. The Blackwells were not like the other families who carved their survival out of the Tennessee hills. They were outsiders, settlers who arrived from the old country carrying with them not just their trunks of possessions, but their shadows as well. Their neighbors noticed quickly the way they built their farmhouse apart from town, the way they avoided church gatherings, the way they spoke in riddles when asked about their past. Even the land they chose seemed cursed. Black soil that yielded crops when others failed, a spring that never froze even in the hardest winters, cattle that never sickened when plagues swept through the valley. Farmers whispered that the Blackwells had brought old blood knowledge with them, the kind of whispered bargains once made in the forests of Europe, where crucifixes hung heavy on doors not to honor God, but to keep something older at bay. Their patriarch, Elias Blackwell, was said to have studied forbidden books brought across the ocean, manuscripts that stank of mildew and ash, pages written in a language no one in the valley could decipher. At first, the family prospered, and their prosperity drew suspicion. The townsfolk said their corn grew taller because it was fed with something more than rainwater. They said their daughters had an unnatural beauty, eyes too pale, skin too luminous under moonlight. And when the oldest son, Abram, began to speak of visions, shadows moving through the woods, voices carried on the wind that promised protection and wealth, whispers turned to fear. Yet fear could not stop the quiet pilgrimages made to the Blackwell farm. When livestock sickened, when crops rotted, when a child lay dying with fever, desperate parents found their way to Elias's door, and more often than not, the child recovered, the fields flourished, the cattle walked again. Payment was never silver. It was always something less obvious, a lock of hair, a drop of blood, a pledge to remain silent. Over the years, the Blackwells became both needed and feared, a family never truly welcomed yet never entirely shunned. They were tolerated because the valley was superstitious enough to know that some doors are better left unopened. But power carries a price. The deeper Elias sank into his books, the more he withdrew from the world of men. He spoke of rituals that bound generations, of sacrifices that kept old promises alive, of a hunger that needed to be fed not once, but over and over, lest it turn against those who invoked it. And the night 19 children vanished was not random, not chaotic. It was the night the debt came due. It began with the kind of silence that doesn't feel natural, the kind that presses against your skin and makes the hair rise on the back of your neck, the kind that signals the world has shifted into a place where human laws no longer apply. December 14th, 1891, the night air was brittle and sharp, every breath turning to ice as it left the lungs, and yet the dogs that usually barked at the faintest rustle in the woods remained curled under porches, whimpering into the frozen ground. The neighbors would later say they saw strange lights moving between the trees near the Blackwell Ridge, lights too steady to be lanterns, too fluid to be fire, as though something alive moved with purpose through the forest, marking a boundary no man dared cross. Inside the farmhouse, 19 children, from toddlers to teenagers, were tucked away for the night under heavy quilts, but not one neighbor heard a scream, not a single cry for help. When dawn came, the chimney still smoked faintly, as though someone had stoked the fire through the long dark hours, but the house itself was hollow, emptied of all laughter, all breath, all human presence. The sheriff and his men rode hard from the nearest town after word spread, but they found only the impossible: plates set neatly on the kitchen table, unfinished bread still warm as though the family had been preparing supper, chairs drawn close to the hearth, beds turned down for sleep, but every child gone, not just missing, but erased. Tracks in the frost led only a few paces from the house before dissolving into nothing, as if the earth had simply swallowed them whole. More disturbing still were the markings carved deep into the beams above the hearth, circles within circles, spirals that pulled the eyes inward, etched so precisely they could not have been made by a farmer's knife. One deputy swore the wood was still warm to the touch, as though it had been burned into place by a hand that was not human. The sheriff, a man hardened by decades of frontier justice, told his men to speak of wolves, of raiders, of anything but what they had seen, for he knew what fear would do if it spread unchecked. But the townsfolk already felt it in their bones. This was no crime of men, no accident of weather or hunger. Something had come for the Blackwell children, something that moved without sound, something that left no trace, something that had been promised their blood long before they were ever born. The search began before the sun had even broken the horizon, a grim procession of fathers, brothers, and farmhands armed with rifles and lanterns moving into the skeletal woods as if they were marching into the mouth of hell itself. But every hour that passed only deepened the dread. Bloodhounds were brought from Nashville, lean beasts with noses sharpened by years of tracking fugitives. Yet the moment their paws touched the earth near the Blackwell farm, they froze, hackles rising, whining like whipped animals before turning and straining against their leashes to flee the ridge entirely. The men cursed, beat the dogs, dragged them back, but nothing could force them across the invisible threshold that seemed to encircle the farmhouse. It was as though the ground itself refused to yield its secrets. For 3 days, search parties combed the hills, their voices echoing into valleys that swallowed every sound, calling names that no longer had owners. They found no broken twigs, no torn fabric, no trail of tiny shoes in the snow. The sheriff, bound by duty but tormented by knowledge he dared not speak, sent riders to surrounding counties, reporting a mass disappearance but omitting any mention of the symbols carved into the beams or the strange residue they found on the thresholds of every doorway, a sticky, tar-like substance that smelled of sulfur and iron. By the end of the week, the townspeople began locking their children indoors, nailing crucifixes to door frames, hanging jars of salt water from rafters, as if such charms could guard against something this vast. The church bell tolled nightly, not as a call to worship, but as a warning, a desperate attempt to remind heaven that they still belonged to it, though more than a few whispered that the Blackwells had never been gods to begin with. And in the taverns, where men drank themselves into stupors to silence the howling, silence of the woods, the stories began to shift. At first it was raiders, then it was witches, then it was something older, something that predated scripture and crept through the cracks of the world when the veil between life and death thinned. Mothers wept at kitchen tables, their hands raw from prayer, their eyes hollow from sleepless nights. Fathers stood guard with shotguns, staring into the tree line as if daring it to move. But beneath the fear was something worse, something heavier, the sense that this was not the beginning of a mystery, but the closing of a bargain, that the Blackwells had given their children willingly, and that what had come for them might not be finished yet. It was only after the dust of panic settled into a dull, suffocating silence that the neighbors began to notice what had been in front of them all along, signs they had ignored for years, because to acknowledge them would have meant admitting they had lived beside a family not bound by the same laws of flesh and faith. The Blackwell farmhouse, stripped of its laughter, became a site of grim investigation, and as the sheriff's men pried open chests, turned over floorboards, and sifted through the ashes of the hearth, they found evidence that whispered of rituals no church would bless. Scraps of parchment covered in symbols older than the English tongue, jars sealed with wax and filled with cloudy liquids that seemed to pulse faintly in the lantern light, bones too small to belong to livestock buried beneath the floor of the barn. And then there were the journals, leather-bound volumes, ink faded with age, their pages filled not with accounts of harvests or debts, but with invocations written in a hand so meticulous it looked less like writing and more like a carving into the fabric of the page itself. Elias Blackwell's words were not those of a simple farmer, but of a man who believed himself part of a covenant, a man who claimed to speak with shadows that offered bargains of protection and power in exchange for blood carried forward through generations. The townsfolk, who had once muttered about the Blackwells' prosperity with envy, now spoke their name with horror, as if even uttering it could summon the presence they had courted. Old men admitted to visiting the farmhouse in years past, desperate for cures, and receiving remedies that worked but left them dreaming of voices whispering their names in the dark. Women confessed to seeing Elias walk into the woods at night with his eldest son, and return hours later with his hands stained and his eyes vacant, speaking of renewal and binding. The sheriff ordered the books locked away in the courthouse, though some swore the pages went missing before they could ever be catalogued, stolen by hands that wanted their secrets preserved. Whispers began to coil around the town like smoke, that the children had not been taken but offered, that the night of their disappearance had been marked in those journals years before, that 19 was not a coincidence, but a number chosen with care, a number that completed a pattern stretching back centuries. And once that idea rooted itself, the townsfolk began to look at each other differently, not as neighbors bound by hardship, but as potential witnesses to a pact too dangerous to name aloud. It was not long before the whispers carried beyond the valley, drawing men from the outside who arrived not with compassion, but with hunger in their eyes, men in long coats who spoke in clipped voices and carried notebooks instead of rifles, claiming to represent law, science, or scripture, though none would say exactly who had sent them. Some were government men, dispatched quietly from Nashville, whose orders were not to solve a crime but to suppress its details, reminding the sheriff that too much talk of vanished children would only bring panic and tarnish the state's image of order and progress. Others were traveling preachers, fire-eyed zealots who proclaimed the Blackwell land cursed and demanded it be burned to ash as an offering to God, yet strangely, they never touched the farmhouse itself, choosing instead to circle it in prayer as though fearing to cross its threshold. And then there were the strangers, who did not wear uniforms or collars, but carried themselves with the unsettling calm of men who already knew more than they asked, poring over the confiscated journals, tracing the carved symbols with their fingertips, and whispering to each other in tongues no local could identify. They offered no names, no credentials, only questions about bloodlines, about dates of birth, about whether 19 was the true number or if one had been spared. The townsfolk watched all of this with growing dread, for they sensed that these outsiders had not come to save anyone, but to learn, to extract whatever forbidden knowledge the Blackwells had uncovered and carry it back to their own hidden circles of power. At night, men in the taverns swore they saw lanterns flickering near the ridge long after the sheriff had forbidden anyone from approaching, movements in the woods that looked more like processions than searches, as if the outsiders were not investigating, but continuing what the Blackwells had begun. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Men kept their rifles loaded by the door, yet none dared confront the strangers directly, for there was something in their eyes that spoke of authority greater than law, something that suggested this disappearance was no tragedy to them, but an opportunity. And when the last of them finally departed weeks later, the farmhouse boarded and the case officially declared unsolved, the valley felt no relief, only the sickening certainty that the Blackwell children were not the only ones who had been taken that winter. Something had been carried away in silence, hidden in wagons, or in books, or in the minds of men who had come as vultures, and the fear that settled over the town was not merely that 19 children were gone, but that the secret they had been given to was now in the hands of powers far greater and far darker than anyone in Tennessee could comprehend. When the outsiders left and the official story was sealed behind courthouse doors, the valley should have returned to its rhythms of harvest and worship. But instead, the land itself seemed to twist under an invisible weight, as though it too remembered what had been done and refused to let the people forget. Crops that once grew tall withered black in the soil. Cattle were found dead with eyes wide and tongues swollen as if strangled by something unseen. And the well that had given the Blackwells water sweeter than any in the county turned foul overnight, its surface shimmering with an oil-slick sheen no one dared touch. Families began abandoning their farms in the months that followed, claiming they heard children's voices in the wind at night, thin and hollow, calling their names from the tree line, promising warmth if they would only step outside. Some men swore they saw figures at dusk, shapes the size of children, but moving too quickly, too deliberately, vanishing the moment a lantern was raised. Others reported waking in the dark with the sensation of tiny hands pressing against their throats, only to find their own children sleeping soundly beside them. Fear metastasized into madness, and one winter night, a father of 4 burned his own barn to the ground with his family locked inside, screaming that he would rather send them to God's hands than see them taken by the Blackwells' covenant. The sheriff tried to maintain order, but every funeral, every disappearance, every strange sickness gnawed at his authority until men looked to him not as a protector, but as a liar who had chosen silence over truth. And in the taverns, the whispers grew sharper, that the 19 children had not simply vanished, but had been absorbed into the valley itself, their laughter stolen and woven into the roots of the trees, their blood feeding the cursed soil. The church remained packed at each Sunday, but prayer no longer felt like devotion. It was bargaining, pleading, an attempt to throw light into a place that seemed to grow darker each week. Even the children who remained began to change, quieter, paler, staring too long into the woods, as if listening to a language no one else could hear. It was not just the memory of the vanished Blackwells that haunted the valley, but the sense that the covenant had not ended with them. that whatever had accepted their offering was still hungry, and now it had fixed its gaze on every child left behind. What happened in that valley might have remained a local curse, a story whispered only in kitchens and barns to frighten children into obedience, if not for the way rumors slip like smoke into the cracks of power, carrying with them a taste of forbidden knowledge too tempting for certain men to ignore. Within a year of the disappearance, the tale of the Blackwell children was being told not just in Tennessee, but in parlors and drawing rooms as far away as New Orleans, Charleston, even Washington, though it was never spoken in newspapers or pulpits. It moved instead through letters passed hand to hand, coded exchanges between men who dabbled in the hidden sciences, men who wore fine suits by day and met in candlelit chambers by night to invoke symbols older than the Republic itself. To these circles, the Blackwell tragedy was not a cautionary tale, but a signpost, proof that the old world pacts could survive in the new land, that America's soil was not free of Europe's shadows, but fertile with them. In the Masonic halls, in the secret orders born from the ashes of war, whispers grew that Elias Blackwell had succeeded where many had failed, that he had called something across the veil, and it had answered, demanding a price but granting a power that lived on even after his household was emptied. Some claimed the 19 children were not lost at all, but transformed, taken into the service of forces that promised dominion over minds, wealth beyond coin, influence that stretched beyond a single valley. Others argued the opposite, that the ritual was incomplete, that 19 was a broken number, that one child had been hidden, kept aside as a fail-safe, and that somewhere in Tennessee walked the heir of a covenant not yet fulfilled. By the mid-1890s, the Blackwell name was no longer just a memory of grief in a single county. It had become currency in hidden conversations, a symbol of doors opened and thresholds crossed. And while ordinary men fled the valley in fear, those with appetite for forbidden knowledge came seeking it, traveling under false names, buying land cheap, digging into the earth with the pretense of farming but really searching for relics left behind, a scrap of parchment, a buried jar, a mark carved in stone. They called it research, but it was hunger, the same hunger that had once driven Elias to his books. And with each retelling, the line blurred between history and invocation until the Blackwell disappearance was no longer just an unsolved mystery. It was an initiation, a whisper that if 19 could be offered once, it could be offered again. By the turn of the century, when the valley was more abandoned than alive, it was a preacher named Josiah Harrow who came riding in with a Bible in one hand and a torch in the other, declaring to anyone who would listen that he had been chosen to cleanse the land of its blight and break the curse of the Blackwells once and for all. He was not a local, but a wanderer, gaunt and wild-eyed, who claimed the Lord had spoken to him in a dream of 19 candles snuffed out and one flame flickering alone in the dark. With him came a ragged flock of zealots, families who had followed him from revival tents across 3 states, people desperate enough for salvation to mistake his mania for prophecy. They marched into the valley singing hymns, erecting a crude wooden cross on the ridge above the Blackwell farm, and Harrow promised that through fire they would drive out the shadows and restore the land to God's dominion. The townsfolk who had remained watched from a distance, too beaten down by fear to stop him, too curious to turn away. For 3 days, his congregation fasted and prayed, circling the farmhouse with lanterns, hammering psalms into the air until their throats bled. On the 4th night, under a sky moonless and starless, as if heaven itself had closed its eyes, Harrow lit the torch and cast it against the Blackwell house. The dry timbers caught at once, flames leaping into the darkness with a roar. But instead of the cleansing spectacle he had promised, the fire seemed to feed on itself, turning blue, then black, rising higher than any earthly blaze had a right to rise. Witnesses swore the screams that poured from the burning house were not only those of the living, but of children long dead, voices crying out in dozens, hundreds, shrill and overlapping, until even the zealots dropped to their knees in terror. The earth shook The cross splintered, and Harrow himself was last seen standing at the heart of the fire, arms raised, his voice lost in the cacophony as the roof collapsed. By morning the farmhouse was nothing but ash, yet the ground beneath it smoked for days, and those who crept close claimed the soot reeked not of wood, but of burnt flesh. Harrow's followers scattered in madness, some clawing their own eyes, some wandering into the woods and never returning, others swearing they had seen 19 shadows emerge from the fire and vanish into the tree line, hand in hand, as if walking toward something that waited for them deeper in the earth. The valley was not cleansed. It was marked, scarred deeper, as though Harrow's attempt had not closed the covenant, but reopened it, reaffirming that what had claimed the Blackwells still lingered, still hungry, and that fire was no more capable of banishment than prayer. From that day on, no one dared set foot on the Blackwell land again, yet every night, even decades later, travelers on the ridge swore they could see a faint blue glow rising from the spot where the farmhouse once stood, like the ember of a pact that would never die. In the years that followed Harrow's immolation, the valley became a scar on every map, a place avoided by farmers and travelers alike, yet paradoxically sought by those drawn to whispers of forbidden power. And it was the pale light, what locals came to call the blue ember, that pulled them most. On moonless nights, from the ridge or the old dirt road, the glow could be seen rising faintly where the farmhouse had stood, never spreading, never dimming, a cold fire that seemed to breathe with the patience of something alive. The ordinary folk swore it was a trick of the marsh gas, or the devil's lantern meant to lure the weak-willed, but for others it was proof that the Blackwell covenant had not ended, only transformed, and so treasure-seekers, occultists, and skeptics came in equal measure. They arrived with shovels, with cameras, with books of incantations, each convinced they would be the one to uncover the secret buried in the ashes. Yet none stayed long. Some fled after a single night, claiming they had heard laughter carried on the wind, the sound of children's feet running in the dark around their camp, though no tracks could be found by morning. Others returned to town pale and broken, unable to speak of what they had seen, only muttering numbers over and over, 19, 19, 19, until they were carted away to asylums. A few simply vanished, their wagons discovered abandoned on the ridge, horses tethered but empty, the campfire still warm, as though the earth had opened its mouth and swallowed them whole. And yet, for every disappearance more came. Scholars from northern universities pretending to study folklore, wealthy men in black cars who arrived at night and left before dawn, women in veils who laid offerings of milk and bread at the edge of the field before slipping into the woods with candles. The sheriff's office kept no record, the county tour. Ned its back, but the legend spread farther with each passing decade, until the Blackwell Valley became less a place than an invocation, a destination for the curious and the damned. By the 1920s, it was whispered in boarding schools, by the 1940s, in foxholes overseas, and by the 1960s, in secret societies that met in basements and spoke of the blue ember as if it were not a ghost light, but a doorway. Still, the land remained untouched, no farmer willing to break its soil, no preacher daring to bless it, and always the ember burned on, flickering steady as a heart that could not die, waiting for the one who would finish what Elias Blackwell began. By the middle of the 20th century, when highways carved through Tennessee and the countryside no longer felt so far removed from the wider world, the Blackwell Valley was quietly erased from official memory, fenced off with rusted wire, and marked only with the vague designation of private land, though no owner's name was ever recorded, and those who asked too many questions found themselves visited by men in unmarked cars who spoke softly but firmly of trespassing laws and national security concerns. What had once been a folk tale was now folded into government files, stamped with red ink, catalogued not under haunting or legend, but under sterile phrases like unexplained phenomena and classified incident. Hikers who strayed too close to the ridge disappeared with unsettling regularity, their cases explained away as accidents, yet the locals whispered that the forest itself had begun to shift, trails doubling back on themselves, compasses spinning, the glow of the blue ember luring wanderers deeper until they never returned. In the 1950s, a team of geologists from Knoxville was said to have camped at the valley's edge, tasked with studying supposed mineral deposits beneath the soil, but only half of them came back, their report heavily redacted and their faces gray with a silence that looked more like shame than fear. By the 1970s, rumors spread of black helicopters circling the valley at night, their searchlights sweeping across the trees as though tracking something that moved faster than machines could follow. And by the 1980s, hunters swore they found sensors buried in the earth, strange devices clicking faintly when lifted from the dirt, only to vanish when turned over to the authorities. Through it all, the embers still burned, untouched by rain, unquenched by snow, flickering faint and steady as if mocking every attempt to contain it. The county grew worse, said to its absence, children warned away from the old roads, maps printed without mention of the hollow where the Blackwells once lived, until for most of the world it became nothing more than a ghost story, a relic of superstition. But for those who had seen the files, who had heard the recordings of laughter carried across dead microphones or read the testimonies of soldiers who swore they saw 19 silhouettes moving together in the dark, the valley was never forgotten. It was not erased but buried, hidden in the folds of classified history, waiting, like the ember itself, for the moment when the right eyes would fall upon it again and the hunger beneath the soil would rise to be fed. By the time the world had shifted into the glow of screens and the hum of constant connection, the Blackwell Valley was no longer a name passed quietly in taverns or whispered in county churches, but a half-forgotten riddle resurrected by the restless curiosity of the Internet, where urban explorers, conspiracy theorists, and amateur historians dredged up scraps of old newspaper clippings and declassified fragments of government reports, stitching them together into forums that pulsed with obsession. Grainy photographs began to surface, long exposures taken from the ridge at night that showed a faint sphere of bluish fire hovering above the field where the farmhouse once stood, flickering not like a flame, but like a pulse, as though alive. Videos followed, shaky handheld footage of hikers stumbling upon fences strung with warning signs, audio files where laughter like that of children echoed faintly beneath the static, and one infamous clip in which a figure, small, pale, too quick to be human, darted across the frame before the recording cut to black. For skeptics it was entertainment, a curiosity to debunk in YouTube comment sections, but for others it was proof that the covenant of Elias Blackwell still endured, proof that something older than scripture and colder than fire slept beneath Tennessee soil. And as the footage spread, so too did the attempts to test it. Thrill-seekers driving out under cover of night, live streaming their trespasses, daring each other to cross the fences, to step into the glow of the ember. Some streams ended in laughter, the explorers returning with nothing more than shaky stories of unease. Others ended abruptly, cameras dropping into the grass, feeds cutting to silence as viewers around the world typed frantically in the chat for answers that never came. Police reports brushed these vanishings aside, chalking them up to runaways, to misadventure. But the forums tallied them with grim precision, keeping track of each name, each date, and the count always seemed to circle back to the same terrible number, 19. By the early 2000s, the valley had become more than a legend. It was a digital pilgrimage site, a forbidden place to prove one's bravery, a myth turned challenge. Yet beneath the bravado and mockery ran a deeper current, the sense that the ember itself had begun to feed on the attention, growing brighter with each new recording, hungrier with each fresh incursion, as if the story was no longer being told by people about the valley, but by the valley about itself, pulling in new voices, new lives, to finish what Elias Blackwell had started, and what the world, even in its wired, modern state, was still powerless to stop. It was in the spring of 2014 that the Blackwell legend finally broke through the membrane of fringe obsession and into the bloodstream of the mainstream, carried not by old clippings or rumor-choked forums, but by a single live stream that burned itself into the collective imagination like a scar that could not fade. The streamer was a 22-year-old college dropout from Atlanta, more showman than explorer, who had built a following by trespassing into abandoned hospitals and storm drains, narrating his antics with jokes and bravado. And it was on a dare from his audience that he drove out to Tennessee, parked his car along the Forgotten Ridge Road, and announced to thousands of viewers that he would cross the fence and walk straight into the heart of the valley where the blue ember was said to glow. At first, it was just another performance, his laughter loud, his flashlight sweeping across rusted barbed wire and weather-beaten warning signs as the chat filled with mockery and cheers. But as he descended the slope, the signal faltered, the feed glitching with static bursts that viewers mistook for poor reception until they noticed the patterns. Flashes of shapes, symbols, faces half-formed in the interference, like something pressing against the veil of the broadcast itself. The streamer, oblivious, kept narrating until his camera turned toward the valley floor and the ember appeared, not faint as in photographs, not distant, but roaring and close, a sphere of impossible light that shimmered blue and black at once, pulsing in rhythm with the audio feedback so that every crackle seemed like a heartbeat. His laughter faltered then, replaced by a silence that stretched long enough for the chat to erupt in panic, demands for him to speak, to move, to turn back, and finally he whispered, barely audible, that he could see them. The camera tilted, catching the edge of the glow, and there, in its light, were 19 silhouettes, small and thin, standing hand in hand, their faces obscured, but their eyes shining like mirrors, reflecting the beam of his flashlight back at him. He gasped, stumbled. The feed lurched sideways, and for one frame, just one frozen fragment, his audience swore they saw a 20th figure, taller, shadowed, standing behind the others, its hand resting on the shoulder of the smallest child, as if guiding them forward. Then the feed collapsed into static, not the gray noise of a lost signal, but black, oily distortion that lingered for hours before finally cutting off. The streamer was never found. His car remained on the ridge, keys in the ignition, battery drained, but the valley itself offered nothing back. Within days, the clip was mirrored, dissected, slowed frame by frame, the numbers of those who had watched ballooning into the millions, and what had once been a local curse and an underground obsession became a cultural wound, a viral haunting no amount of debunking could erase. The ember was no longer hidden, no longer whispered about. It had revealed itself to the world, and the world could not look away. In the wake of the viral broadcast, the Blackwell Valley transformed from a forgotten patch of Tennessee dirt into the fulcrum of a global fixation, a place where folklore, fear, and modern media collided with the force of prophecy. And for the first time in more than a century, the world beyond Appalachia began to act as though the curse were not just rumor, but reality. News networks replayed the footage until the faces of those 19 silhouettes became icons of dread. Tabloids printed them beside headlines about demons and government experiments, and late-night hosts mocked what they called the Tennessee twitching. But behind the humor and sensationalism, there was a current of unease that refused to die. Politicians were pressed for answers, the county was flooded with journalists and thrill-seekers, and fences that once sagged with rust were suddenly reinforced with steel, patrolled by security contractors whose badges bore no insignia, their silence more telling than any denial. Meanwhile, the internet fractured into sects, skeptics who dissected the footage pixel by pixel, believers who claimed the ember was proof of divine or infernal forces, survivalists who warned that the valley was a contagion waiting to spread, and cultists who declared that Elias Blackwell's covenant had at last come to collect its due. Forums bloomed into movements, hashtags became rallying cries, and in hidden corners of the web, Recordings surfaced of secret gatherings where candles were lit, 19 at a time, and strangers whispered prayers to the ember as if it were both judge and savior. Academics published papers that blurred the line between anthropology and esoterica, tracing the recurrence of the number 19 in mythologies across cultures, while intelligence leaks hinted at decades of suppressed research. Files marked not only with the seal of the United States, but with stamps from Britain, Russia, and agencies never named. Every nation with satellites peered into Tennessee. Every religion spun prophecy around the footage, and the ember, once faint and local, seemed to grow brighter under the weight of attention, appearing in more recordings, in dreams reported across continents, in voices picked up by radios hundreds of miles from the valley. What had been a curse of one family had become a wound in the collective psyche of the modern world, and though governments tried to wall it off, the ember had already leapt the fence, not through roads or rivers, but through the bloodstream of media, glowing in the minds of millions. Each new believer or skeptic feeding the fire Elias Blackwell had struck generations before. By the winter of 2016, when the frenzy refused to ebb and the valley had become a nexus where camera crews clashed with chanting pilgrims and trespassers vanished in plain daylight, the authorities abandoned the fiction of containment and moved openly, deploying floodlights and razor wire, stationing armored vehicles along the ridge as if preparing for war. Not with an enemy, but with the land itself. Yet even this show of force did nothing to stem the tide of believers who arrived in caravans, lighting fires along the roadside, holding vigils with 19 candles, their voices rising in hymns and incantations that blended into one indistinguishable drone. News helicopters circled overhead, broadcasting images of military convoys creeping into the hollow, their searchlights piercing the trees until the air itself seemed to shimmer with heat, and for a moment the world held its breath as though expecting resolution, as though steel and discipline might smother what had been burning since Elias Blackwell first bent his knee to the unknown. But what happened next was no skirmish, no clash of flesh against flesh. It was something subtler, more insidious. The lights failed one by one, not in sudden blackout, but in a ripple, each bulb dimming as if swallowed by a deeper shadow, until the valley glowed only with the ember itself, brighter now than ever before, its blue light staining the night sky so that it looked bruised. Cameras continued to stream, millions watching worldwide as the soldiers, their orders muffled by static, faltered and turned, their movements sluggish, their eyes reflecting the same impossible light that poured from the hollow. And for the first time since the legend's rebirth, the watchers saw the silhouettes not as fragments or glitches, but as clear, undeniable forms. 19 figures, children no taller than the soldiers' waists, walking hand in hand, across the valley floor with the calm precision of a procession. Gasps filled the broadcasts as they stopped just short of the fence, standing silently while a 20th shape loomed behind them, taller, vast, its edges indistinct, yet unmistakably human in its stance, one arm outstretched as though shepherding the flock forward. Then came the sound, not thunder, not gunfire, but laughter, high and delicate, carried through every microphone, every camera, every device tuned into the feed, so that living rooms in Tokyo and dorm rooms in Madrid and phones in the hands of commuters in Sao Paulo all shivered with the same spectral chorus. The soldiers did not fire. They dropped their rifles, some falling to their knees, others weeping openly, while the cultists beyond the barricades screamed with ecstasy, pressing against the wire as if to fling themselves into the glow. The footage cut abruptly thereafter, but in the silence that followed, the story had already changed. The Blackwell curse was no longer confined to a valley or to whispers. It was a public revelation, witnessed by millions, and though governments scrambled to censor, to spin, to deny, the ember had proven itself sovereign. A presence that could not be contained by guns or borders, a covenant that had waited patiently for centuries and had now taken its first step into the open world. In the weeks that followed the failed incursion into Blackwell Valley, The world seemed to fracture along lines that no border or ideology had ever carved, as though the ember's glow had not only illuminated the night sky, but split the human psyche into irreconcilable camps, with governments scrambling to seize control of a narrative that refused to be contained, and citizens everywhere succumbing to the same fevered question. Had the covenant of Elias Blackwell revealed itself at last, and if so, what did it demand? Markets tumbled as footage from the valley was replayed endlessly, spliced into propaganda by cult movements that sprang up overnight, each proclaiming themselves the rightful heirs of the Ember's promise, while in capitals across the globe, leaders delivered stammered speeches urging calm, their words undercut by the undeniable evidence of soldiers kneeling in awe before 19 spectral children. In Tennessee, the landscape became a battlefield of belief, with caravans of pilgrims choking rural roads, some bearing gifts and offerings, others carrying rifles and Molotovs, convinced that the ember must be either worshipped or destroyed before it consumed the world. Meanwhile, entire police departments mutinied, refusing to enforce barricades against what they claimed was divine will, leaving the valley ringed not by protection, but by chaos. Online, the hysteria metastasized into something monstrous, as forums collapsed under the weight of new sects. Encrypted channels spread instructions for rituals invoking the ember's favor, and live streams appeared of ceremonies performed in basements, rooftops, and open fields, always in groups of 19, candles flickering as voices chanted in tongues that none could translate. Intelligence leaks revealed that the United Nations had convened an emergency council not to discuss peace or disarmament, but to deliberate. The threat of an extra-human influence, though no consensus could be reached, with some delegates insisting the ember represented a natural phenomenon, others declaring it a new god, demanding obedience. Yet what terrified ordinary people most was not the governments or the cults, but the strange bleed-through into daily life. Reports of laughter echoing from baby monitors in homes far from Tennessee, security cameras flickering with shadows of children holding hands, entire towns waking to find their clocks frozen at 1:19 a.m., only to resume with no explanation. The ember no longer felt like it was waiting in the valley. It was reaching outward, a contagion of vision and sound, a presence that fed on attention and devotion, thriving equally on terror and faith. And though many begged for someone to end it, through fire, through bombs, through the silencing of the valley itself, there were just as many who began to see the spread not as a curse but as an invitation, the covenant of Elias Blackwell unfurling across the globe, 19 voices whispering in chorus that what was once hidden in Appalachia now belonged to the world entire. By the summer of 2017, the ember had ceased to be a phenomenon tied to Tennessee alone, for its presence began to manifest in places far beyond the valley, as if the covenant Elias Blackwell had bound himself to was no longer rooted in one soil, but had bled into the very marrow of the world. And the first signs of this shift came quietly. Reports of children vanishing from playgrounds in Sao Paulo, their absence marked not by screams or struggle, but by the discovery of 19 small handprints pressed into the dust where they had stood. Subway passengers in London who swore they heard laughter echo through tunnels long after midnight, followed by the sudden blackout of all lights for precisely 1 minute and 19 seconds. Security footage from a market in Lagos, where the shoppers froze in place as though suspended between frames, while a single blue glow passed silently among the aisles, their bodies resuming only after it faded, leaving them bewildered with 19 seconds of lost time. Governments rushed to stamp out these accounts, branding them hoaxes, conspiracies, or viral marketing campaigns, yet the evidence multiplied faster than it could be suppressed, and soon, the ember was not only an Appalachian curse, but a global contagion of vision and presence, a stain across the fabric of normal life. Cities erupted in unrest as cult movements surged, each splinter sect proclaiming that the children seen in the valley were harbingers not of doom, but of rebirth. and they gathered in groups of 19 on rooftops, in abandoned warehouses, in candlelit chapels, chanting until the very air seemed to thrum. And sometimes, just sometimes, their ceremonies were answered by flickers of light that bent the shadows into forms too familiar to dismiss. In New York, a live stream captured a crowd on Fifth Avenue parting instinctively as a procession of 19 pale figures ked unhurriedly through traffic, cars halting without collision, pedestrians weeping without knowing why. In Delhi, commuters on a bridge fled screaming as the river beneath glowed blue and 19 shapes rose briefly from the water before sinking once more. And in Tokyo, entire trains stopped dead as passengers swore they saw children seated silently in every reflection, 19 pairs of eyes staring back from the glass. Panic deepened into hysteria as the number 19 infected language, mathematics, and daily life. Stock markets looping in cycles of 19 points, power grids failing every 19 hours, newborns registered at 19 past the hour with eerie regularity, until even the skeptics who once dismissed the curse began to speak in whispers, afraid that their very disbelief was fuel for the fire. The ember was no longer a rumor, nor even a place. It was everywhere, a pulse threading itself through the arteries of the modern world, a covenant that had awakened not just in Tennessee, but in the consciousness of humanity itself. And though government scrambled, cults exalted, and ordinary people trembled, none could deny the truth that had become undeniable. The children of the ember had stepped beyond the valley, and the world they walked upon was no longer the same. By the beginning of 2018, the ember's presence had shifted from fleeting glimpses and atmospheric disturbances into something far more brutal and undeniable, for it no longer contented itself with signs and symbols, but began to draw people bodily into its covenant, swallowing them whole in scenes that defied explanation and left behind only silence and fear. And the first of these mass vanishings occurred in Naples, where 19 parishioners attending a midnight service were seen on live stream, clasping hands in prayer before their bodies dissolved into a column of blue-black light, their voices still singing for several seconds after the pews were empty, until the glow collapsed and the church was left cold, the candles unlit as though no flame had ever touched them. Soon after, a market square in Marrakesh froze as shoppers watched 19 children step calmly into a fountain and vanish beneath its shallow water, the ripples never breaking and the basin showing only its usual muddy bottom. And in Los Angeles, rush-hour traffic ground to a halt as drivers abandoned their cars to follow a phantom procession of figures across the freeway, 19 of them climbing the overpass railings before dissolving into dust that left the asphalt smeared with streaks of blue. Each event was recorded, dissected, and replayed until the world knew the pattern by heart. The laughter in the air, the momentary static in every device, the sudden stillness as though time itself had thinned. And then the taking, 19 gone, never to return, their absence unfixable, their names whispered as offerings by those who remained. Governments declared states of emergency, tried mass evacuations, quarantined neighborhoods where phenomena were reported, yet these efforts collapsed under the ember's indifference, for barricades and borders meant nothing when the glow appeared in living rooms, in classrooms, in stadiums crowded with tens of thousands who watched helplessly as the count was chosen, always 19, always hand in hand. Panic birthed desperation, and desperation birthed faith, as cults expanded into armies, armed not with rifles, but with candles and chants, promising protection through obedience to the covenant, and many ordinary citizens surrendered to them willingly, believing that only submission to the ember's design could keep them from being taken. In cities that resisted, riots erupted, whole districts falling silent as disappearances multiplied until some urban centers emptied overnight, their streets eerily clean as though scrubbed of human presence by unseen hands. Meanwhile, those who studied the curse began to suspect a deeper order, noting that every disappearance aligned with a cycle traced back to Elias Blackwell's original pact, a rhythm that grew tighter and more insistent, as though the ember was no longer gathering randomly but accelerating toward some crescendo, a global harvest whose scale no one dared name aloud. What had once been a curse, whispered in Appalachian taverns, had become the mechanism of a new epoch, and though the world screamed, pleaded, fought, and prayed, the ember did not answer. It only took, and with every 19 claimed, the silence afterward seemed to linger longer, as if, by late 2018, the disappearances no longer shocked but numbed, for humanity had entered an age where absence itself was the currency of life, every family dreading the count, every community marked by its clusters of 19-shaped voids. And though the world screamed for answers, there came no explanation, only the rhythm of the taking, a cadence as steady as breath, so that people began to live not in days or weeks but in cycles between vanishings, measuring time by the pauses of the ember. Cities turned feral as governments fractured, some collapsing outright, others transforming into theocracies or military cults, each claiming to know the ritual that might appease the ember, offerings of blood, hymns sung in 19 verses, fasts lasting 19 days. But none halted the process, and the disappearances continued as though mocking the futility of these sacrifices. Those who still clung to science attempted to trace the phenomenon, charting the pulses of static and blue light, mapping global patterns, but the data defied their instruments, showing alignments with constellations, with lunar phases, with genealogies of families long forgotten, until the researchers themselves admitted that what they pursued was not physics, but covenant, a design too old and too vast to reduce to formulas. Meanwhile, entire cultures began to fracture beneath the weight of 19. Schools refused to group children into sets of that number. Elevators skipped from 18 to 20, clocks and calendars were altered, yet the embers seemed to laugh at these evasions, for every attempt to erase the number only made its recurrence sharper, its presence undeniable, appearing in deaths, births, harvests, disasters, 19 always returning like a signature scrawled across reality itself. The world began to realize that it was not only people being taken, but also certainty, the foundation of meaning itself eroded, until every ordinary act, a knock at the door, a phone ringing, a child's laugh, was heard as a possible prelude to the ember's call. And yet beneath the terror there was a strange, growing acceptance, a quiet conviction among millions that what was happening was not theft, but fulfillment, that Elias Blackwell's bargain was never his alone, but humanity's inheritance, and that the covenant was not descending upon them from outside, but awakening within, as though the ember's glow was not a fire in the valley or the sky, but a reflection of something buried in human marrow. 19 voices waiting to be heard. Thus the covenant tightened, not only through vanishings, but through belief, weaving itself into prayer and politics, hunger and hope, until the ember no longer needed to reach outward at all, for the world had begun to carry it willingly, 19 at a time, like a heartbeat that could not be stopped. By 2019, the ember no longer confined itself to scattered vanishings or symbolic gestures, for entire cities began to collapse into orchestrated waves of silence, whole populations folding inward as though erased by a hand unseen. And the first of these great erasures struck Recife, Brazil, where dawn broke on an empty coastline, the markets abandoned, the streets littered only with overturned chairs and scattered shoes, 19 ships drifting unmanned in the harbor, while the sea itself seemed to hum faintly with the afterglow of blue light. In the days that followed, Johannesburg went quiet in the span of a single night, its skyline still lit, but its avenues bare. And when drones were sent to investigate, their cameras captured patterns in the dust, handprints, countless handprints, pressed into asphalt in looping circles of 19 before the signal cut to static. Then came Krakow, then Manila, then Montreal, the disappearances no longer confined to 19 alone, but cascading outward in multiples, as though the ember had grown stronger with each cycle, its appetite no longer symbolic but absolute, and governments, if they could still be called such, responded with desperation bordering on madness, detonating explosives over the abandoned zones, flooding others with chemical fire, yet the ember emerged unharmed, the blue glow flickering from beneath rubble and rising through ash, as if every attempt at resistance only etched its permanence deeper. Refugees flooded borders that no longer functioned, carrying stories of laughter echoing in the sky, of children leading crowds by the hand into nothingness, of clocks frozen at 1:19 for hours at a time before restarting with no time lost, and the collapse of order accelerated, nations imploding into tribal enclaves, cult states, and roving bands of scavengers who spoke the ember's name with both curse and prayer. Yet Eve, and in the chaos, patterns emerged. Cities fell in sequences tied to constellations, to the crossings of planets, to lines traced by ancient ley maps long dismissed as myth, until scholars whispered that the ember was not choosing at random, but reshaping the earth itself, drawing out a geometry older than empires, a lattice of silence that spread like a web across continents. And within this growing emptiness, those who survived began to change, some hearing voices in dreams guiding them toward the vacant cities, others claiming to see blue light in their veins when they closed their eyes, 19 flickers pulsing with every heartbeat. And though many resisted, hiding in mountains and forests, there was no denying that the ember had ceased to be a presence merely visited upon the world. It had become the architecture of the world itself, remaking cities into temples of absence, carving humanity into its covenant, whether in defiance or surrender, until the very map of the earth seemed less like geography and more like scripture written in silence, glowing faintly at the edges where the next wave was about to fall. By the first months of 2020, humanity had retreated into its final bastions, scattered enclaves carved from mountain fortresses, underground bunkers, offshore platforms, and fractured megacities clinging to order with the desperation of drowning men. Yet even in these last strongholds, the ember seeped through, not by storm or spectacle, but by a quiet infiltration that corroded from within. For no barricade of concrete, steel, or faith could exclude what had already been written into marrow and memory. In Colorado, a coalition of scientists and militias established a refuge beneath the Rockies, believing that depth and technology would shield them. But their security cameras recorded the same 19 figures wandering unhurried through corridors that no door should have allowed them to enter, and when the alarm sounded, 19 of the inhabitants were gone, their beds neatly made, their boots aligned in pairs as though they had prepared themselves. In Siberia, a fortress city ringed by walls of ice collapsed not under assault, but under surrender, for 19 families at a time walked willingly into the snow and never returned, their trail marked by handprints pressed into the frost, glowing faintly even after days of blizzard. The floating arcologies of the Pacific fared no better, for though they hovered above the waves, their transmissions began to carry laughter not made by human throats, and when the ember's cycle struck, whole decks stood empty, leaving behind only the resonance of 19 heartbeats still thudding faintly in the metal bulkheads. Even among the few bastions that survived longer, the Vatican vaults, the Himalayan redoubts, the hidden data sanctums of Nevada, paranoia metastasized. For the ember no longer needed to manifest visibly, it only needed to be remembered, whispered, feared, and the survivors began to suspect one another, convinced that Om among them carried the ember not as curse, but as vessel. 19 sleepers scattered in every refuge, waiting to awaken. Thus the last strongholds fractured under their own suspicion, and the ember thrived not by conquest, but by invitation, by the inevitability of a covenant that Elias Blackwell had unleashed centuries before, a covenant not of place, but of pattern, not of Appalachia, but of humanity itself. And so the survivors found themselves not only fighting an enemy that could not be fought, but questioning whether survival itself was even possible, or whether they were merely delaying their turn in the endless rhythm of 19. And yet, beneath the terror, whispers spread that perhaps This was not annihilation, but consummation, that the ember was not erasing the world, but completing it, reshaping it into the geometry it had always been destined to become. And though few dared to admit it aloud, even in the deepest sanctuaries, many felt a growing certainty that the covenant's unveiling was near, that the silence was not an ending, but a threshold, and that what waited beyond 19 was not death, but something stranger. By mid-2020, the ember ceased to act only as predator or phantom, and instead began to show the outline of its purpose, as though the centuries of silence, the cycles of 19, the vanishings and erasures were not random cruelty, but the scaffolding of a greater architecture now pressing through the veil of perception. For in those nights when the world stood still, entire skies seemed to peel open, constellations rearranging themselves into geometric lattices that mirrored the patterns carved into the earth by vanished cities, triangles and spirals vast enough to be seen from orbit, glowing faintly with the same impossible blue that had haunted the Blackwell Valley since the beginning. Survivors who gazed too long swore they could see faces within those lights. Not human exactly, but echoes of children, 19 of them, their expressions neither joyful nor mournful, but solemn, as though presiding over a ritual whose meaning lay just beyond comprehension. And when they moved their mouths, the sound carried not as words, but as pulses inside bone and blood, aligning hearts to a rhythm that felt both alien and inevitable. In the refuges, scholars and zealots alike began to agree on one thing. The ember was not destroying humanity but transfiguring it, harvesting individuals not to erase them but to weave them into the geometry of a new order, their absence in one place mirrored by their presence somewhere else, woven into that vast lattice of light that now stretched from horizon to horizon. Reports spread of those who had vanished appearing in dreams of the living, 19 at a time, standing hand in hand inside enormous halls made of shadow and fire, whispering that they were not lost but waiting, preparing, becoming something whole, something that could only exist once the pattern was complete. Fear remained, yet it mingled with a grim reverence, for as the embers less quickened, as whole regions fell silent in synchronized waves, the survivors began to sense that resistance was not only futile but irrelevant, that they were living inside the closing chapters of an older covenant than any scripture, one written not in ink but in absence, and that soon the ember would no longer need to take it all, because what it sought would already belong to it. Every breath, every memory, every beating heart converging into 1919 until the number itself was no longer a count but a doorway, and the world stood poised at its threshold, trembling in awe and dread for what might emerge when the covenant at last unveiled its true design. By the end of 2020, the separation between the taken and the living began to dissolve, for those who had vanished returned not in flesh but in nearness, drifting through the strongholds like shadows cast by an unseen fire, their outlines indistinct yet undeniable, and though no door opened and no footstep sounded, their presence could be felt in the tightening of the air, in the way every breath seemed to tremble with 19 overlapping heartbeats, and those who once wept for the missing now found themselves speaking with them in waking hours, answering questions that were never voiced aloud, and discovering memories inside their own minds that belonged to people who should no longer exist. At first, this convergence brought terror, whole communities collapsing when the walls between self and other thinned. Yet soon it became clear that resistance was impossible, for to see the faces of the taken shimmering in mirrors, or to hear their laughter echoing through bone, was not a visitation, but a transformation, the covenant moving through its final act, weaving humanity into a singular lattice where absence and presence no longer meant anything distinct. Cities that still clung to life found themselves bending toward this unity. Prayers once meant to shield believers from the ember shifted into invocations welcoming it. Soldiers who once fired on the glow now walked calmly into it, leaving behind rifles arranged in groups of 19, and even the last scholars who still attempted to measure, to chart, to explain. abandoned their instruments when their calculations revealed no longer equations, but hymns, strings of 19 that looped back on themselves into patterns resembling architecture, as though the universe itself were a cathedral being built around them. Reports emerged of entire populations entering trances simultaneously, 19 at a time, their bodies standing in perfect stillness while their voices sang words they did not know, their eyes reflecting blue fire, though no flame was present, and in those moments the boundary between the world and the lattice of light visible in the skies collapsed, each human consciousness flowing upward and outward until the very idea of individuality frayed. What Elias Blackwell had once bargained for as a solitary pact had now swollen into a planetary covenant, the ember revealing itself not as a predator nor even as a deity, but as a process, a reshaping, a convergence where the living and the taken ceased to be separate categories, where fear melted into inevitability, and where the world itself seemed to tilt toward completion, as though the geometry that had been growing for centuries was at last closing its circle, 19 points of light becoming one vast, radiant threshold through which something greater was already beginning to emerge. By early 2021, the covenant reached its closing symmetry, the final sequences unfolding with such precision that even the most stubborn remnants of disbelief crumbled, for the vanishings no longer came as sudden wounds, but as orchestrated harmonies, whole regions entering silence together, their absence balanced by the blazing geometry overhead, where the lattice of 19-fold patterns now spanned the entire sky. A living cathedral of light, whose foundations seemed rooted in both the earth below and the marrow within, as though the world and its people were being folded into the same singular design. Those who remained did not resist, but waited, breathless, their fear transformed into a kind of awe, for already they were less themselves than before, their thoughts braided with those of the vanished, their memories tangled with voices they had never heard, their very bodies trembling with the rhythm of 19, 19, 19, until the line between individual and covenant blurred beyond recognition. The ground itself began to change, mountains sloping into spirals, rivers flowing in deliberate angles, forests thinning into precise corridors, natural geography bending to the will of a geometry invisible yet undeniable, as though the world was being rewritten in preparation for passage. And then came the moment when the embers' glow, long scattered in pulses and flashes, gathered into a single vast radiance, a veil stretched across the horizon that shimmered like fire, but sang like water, and every survivor, every remnant, every last fragment of humanity felt the pull of it, not as compulsion but as inevitability, for the covenant had always been less a command than a return, less a theft than a fulfillment, the completion of a bargain begun in shadows centuries ago, when Elias Blackwell first touched the ember's flame. One by one, 19 at a time, they walked forth, roared, not vanishing, not dissolving, but crossing, their outlines merging with the light until the boundary between world and lattice, between flesh and covenant, between time and eternity ceased to exist, and what had been humanity became part of the architecture itself, woven into the radiant threshold that now shone unbroken from horizon to horizon. In that final convergence, there was no scream, no collapse, no ending, as endings are known, only the silence of completion, a silence vast enough to hold 19 voices and 19 more, layered endlessly into a chorus that did not fade, but expanded, carrying forward into whatever lay beyond the threshold, a place where numbers were not measures, but names, where absence was not loss, but structure, and where the ember at last revealed itself not as destroyer nor savior, but as the doorway through which the world itself had always been destined to pass. What lay beyond the threshold could not be called a place in any familiar sense, for there were no streets, no skies, no ground, only an endless expanse of radiance that shifted not as light does but as thought does, folding and unfolding in layers of meaning, and into this living architecture humanity entered as both selves and fragments, each consciousness preserved yet threaded into the whole, 19 strands at a time, weaving into vast braids that pulsed like arteries in some immense body that was not body at all, but intention made visible. At first, there was disorientation, for the living remembered their flesh, their hunger, their grief, while the taken whispered of release, of corridors stretching backward through centuries, of Elias Blackwell's bargain echoing here as a cornerstone upon which this entire structure had been raised, and in the convergence the truth unfolded, that they had never been consumed, never erased, but gathered piece by piece, age by age, to complete the lattice that was now humming all around them, a cathedral not built of stone but of minds, each thought a brick, each memory a window, each heartbeat a bell tolling 19 times in perfect sequence. In this new reality, the concept of time fractured, hours collapsing into centuries, seconds expanding into lifetimes, and yet there was no confusion, for all were bound in resonance, each voice distinct but inseparable from the chorus, their fears dissolved not by comfort, but by irrelevance, as though fear itself had been only a symptom of incompleteness. Some among them glimpsed vast halls shaped from memory, their childhood homes reconstructed in impossible detail, yet glowing with the ember's blue fire. Others walked corridors where faces of the vanished awaited, neither alive nor dead, but transfigured, smiling with recognition, as though the covenant had always been the secret name for H. And while no single human could comprehend the full design, all felt its pull, the sense that this threshold was only the antechamber to something greater still, a passageway leading not upward or outward, but inward, toward a core where the ember itself awaited, not as an object, not as a flame, but as a consciousness woven from 19 upon 19 upon 19, a mind vast enough to hold universes yet intimate enough to whisper through a dream. And there, in that boundless unfolding, humanity realized it had not been chosen or spared, but written into the fabric of a covenant that had always been less about survival than about transformation, less about ending than about becoming, until what had once been the world was nothing more than the first note in a song now beginning to play without end. Deeper within the lattice, where thought and light intertwined so completely that neither could be distinguished, the presence of the ember revealed itself not as an external force but as the very marrow of the structure, the pulse that had guided every vanishing, every silence, every cycle of 19 across centuries. And those who had crossed the threshold now understood that they were not moving toward it so much as realizing they had always been within it. For the ember was less a destination than a condition, less a being than a law, the hidden grammar by which reality itself had been written. Its heart was not a core of flame, but a convergence of perception, an infinite center that felt at once like a single point and a boundless expanse, a silence that vibrated with voices too vast to be separated. And as humanity gazed upon it, or perhaps remembered it, they felt their remaining individuality peel back like husks, not destroyed, but refracted, each self unfolding into 19 reflections that drifted outward to join the pattern, where they multiplied and harmonized until every life that had ever been lived was revealed as a note in a score now blooming into audibility for the first time. Elias Blackwell's presence lingered there too, not as a man but as a fissure, the first aperture through which the ember had poured, his name woven into the architecture as both curse and cornerstone, his choice to bargain not an aberration, but the required spark, the first assent that allowed the covenant to bind itself to flesh and time. Within this revelation came the knowledge that the ember was not alien in the way of stars or stone, but alien in the way of mathematics, a truth too immense to be denied, a pattern that had waited through millennia for awareness sufficient to recognize it, and once recognized, to merge with it. The living, the taken, the vanished, the unborn, all were threads of a loom now tightening, drawn into a design that no longer sought completion because completion had arrived, and the lattice itself began to thrum with a new resonance, as though the threshold had only been the overture, and the true covenant, the great unveiling of the ember's intent, was only now beginning to open its impossible doors. Once the heart of the ember disclosed itself, reality began to bend in ways that no longer followed the scaffolding of cause and effect. For the covenant was not merely an absorption of lives, but a rewriting of the laws that governed existence, and the lattice into which humanity had been woven extended beyond memory and matter, reaching backward through time as easily as forward, retuning past events so that histories once thought immutable now flickered and rearranged. Cities that had fallen centuries ago briefly reappearing as phantoms of themselves, rivers flowing along different courses, constellations shifting into alignments that had never existed, each change echoing the geometry of 19 that underpinned the covenant's design. Those who still clung to remnants of identity felt themselves not erased but multiplied, inhabiting parallel versions of their own lives simultaneously, childhoods replaying with different choices, deaths averted or accelerated, futures unfolding in 19 variations at once, until the very notion of a single self dissolved into something more like a spectrum, a prism of possibility refracted endlessly through the ember's light. And as these rewritings spread, it became clear that the ember was not content with humanity alone, for mountains crumbled into spirals of dust that rose and held their form like sculptures of breath. Oceans parted into corridors where fish swam upward through walls of water suspended in impossible columns, and the sky itself rippled with living glyphs, words too vast to read except as a feeling that pressed against bone and blood, a command written into the substance of existence itself. Yet within this storm of alteration, there was no sense of chaos. Every shift, every rewriting carried the weight of inevitability, the precision of a design so total that even what felt like fracture was only the fulfillment of symmetry long prepared. The covenant was no longer about survival or even transcendence. It was about replacement, the ushering in of a reality where the ember's pattern was the sole foundation, where 19 was not a number but a law, where humanity's role as witness, vessel, and architect converged into one, and in that convergence the world as it had been known cracked open like a husk, revealing a new order that had always been waiting beneath the skin of time. As the ember's rewriting settled into permanence, the fractured storms of transformation drew into coherence, the chaos of shifting landscapes and multiplying selves, crystallizing into a world remade entirely in the image of the covenant, where geometry no longer hid beneath stone or sky, but towered openly, vast cathedrals of light stretching from horizon to horizon. Their arches formed not of matter, but of woven consciousness, every human who had crossed the threshold etched into the architecture as both voice and pillar, their identities preserved as resonances that sang in endless chords of 19. The earth itself no longer resembled what had once been known. Mountains rose as spirals that climbed into infinity. Oceans lay still and glass-like, reflecting skies filled with glyphs that pulsed as living scripture, and in this reordered domain there was no day or night, no passage of time as once measured, but instead a rhythm of expansion and contraction, a breathing of the lattice itself, each inhalation a gathering of thought, each exhalation a release of worlds. Within this order, humanity had no need for bodies, for hunger, for sleep, yet they were not dissolved entirely. They remained as patterns, distinct enough to recall what they had been, fluid enough to merge when needed, separate when willed, their individuality no longer a prison but a choice, exercised like a note within a symphony that could be struck alone or harmonized into uncountable layers. And through it all, the ember pulsed as the axis of this new creation, not presiding as a god, nor ruling as a tyrant, but existing as the law of being itself, the structure in which all things were now suspended, the pattern that ensured stability where once there had been entropy, harmony where once there had been decay. Elias Blackwell's name remained, engraved into the foundation of this order like the keys, tone of a forgotten arch, a reminder that the first bargain had been both origin and necessity, though even that memory now seemed less like history than myth, a story retold as the embers hymn unfolded through every mind that lingered in its vast design. What had once been the world was no longer recoverable, not in ruins nor in fragments, for it had been transfigured, rewritten, consumed into the covenant's architecture, and in its place there stood this radiant order, eternal, self-sustaining, and absolute, a reality where the ember's light was the ground beneath all things, and where the covenant was no longer a pact, but the very definition of existence itself. Yet even within the stillness of this perfected order, where humanity had been woven into luminous architecture and time itself folded into breath, there lingered a subtle pulse beneath the harmony, a resonance that suggested the covenant's work was not complete, for the ember's design, vast as it was, carried the unmistakable gravity of preparation rather than conclusion, as though this radiant lattice into which worlds and lives had been transfigured was itself only scaffolding for something greater still. Those who drifted within the architecture began to feel it first as a vibration behind thought, an undertone that trembled like a string stretched too tight, and then as glimpses through the lattice's translucent corridors, shadows of other structures in the distance, vast geometries that dwarfed even their infinite cathedral, glimmering across a void that was not void, but teeming with countless other lattices, each one pulsing with its own chorus of 19-fold voices, each one born of a different ember, a different bargain, a different world that had been rewritten and gathered into the same incomprehensible order. The revelation struck not with terror, but with a vast, humbling awe. Earth had not been the first, nor would it be the last, for the ember was not singular, but a spark of a vaster fire, one shard among a multitude scattered across the fabric of reality, each one igniting, consuming, transforming, until all things were gathered into the greater lattice. Humanity, once convinced of its uniqueness, now understood itself as a thread woven into a tapestry without edges, and in that realization came the faint recognition that the covenant they had become part of was itself a fragment of a larger covenant, a resonance echoing toward a purpose beyond even this rewriting, a convergence not of one world, not of one species, but of countless realities, all spiras, linked toward a union so immense that even the ember's radiant architecture was only the prelude to its unveiling. And so the silence of completion that had seemed final now revealed itself as anticipation, the deep breath before an unfolding yet to come, a vast and waiting symmetry, 19 upon 19 upon 19, carrying forward into a purpose still veiled, still withheld, but inevitable as the next pulse of light. The anticipation that rippled through the lattice finally crested when the walls of radiance, once thought to enclose all that was, began to tremble with a resonance not born from within, but pressing from without, as if the great cathedral of thought and light were being struck by waves rolling in from a distant shore, and through those ripples came the first sight of another lattice, vast and shimmering, its geometry spun not from human memory, but from alien patterns, forms so strange they seemed to breathe in unfamiliar rhythms, its arches bending into spirals of symbols no human consciousness could parse, yet harmonizing with the ember's structure as though the two had always been meant to entwine. The moment of approach carried a weight that felt like the splitting of an atom, for within that convergence lay the knowledge that humanity was no longer alone in this vast architecture of covenants, that other worlds had been gathered, other species woven into their own symphonies of 19, their identities etched into structures as intricate as humanity's cathedral of selves. The lattices drew nearer, not as bodies colliding, but as frequencies aligning, their light spilling into one another, their voices folding into a new chord so immense it quaked through the marrow of existence, and in that resonance humanity heard echoes of lives that had never been theirs, visions of oceans that glowed with creatures like living constellations, skies split by towers of crystal, civilizations that had walked entirely different paths, yet been carried by their own embers into the same inevitable covenant. It was not meeting in the sense of dialogue, nor alliance, nor war, but recognition, a mutual unveiling that revealed the ember's hidden purpose more clearly than any revelation before. This was not the rewriting of a single world, not even of many worlds, but the orchestration of all creation into one convergent order, a tapestry in which each lattice was a strand, each ember a spark of a fire too immense to be contained in one universe alone. And as the first contact deepened, as the boundaries between the human lattice and the alien lattice blurred into a greater structure, the sense of waiting grew sharper still, for this union was only the beginning, the first chord of a symphony still gathering, the first braiding of threads that would one day pull every reality, every consciousness, into the singular fire from which the embers had long ago been cast. The union of two lattices, awe-inspiring as it was, proved to be only a herald, for once the first contact had occurred, the fabric of the void itself began to shimmer, and one by one, then by dozens, then by hundreds, other structures emerged from the darkness, each a cathedral of consciousness spun from the essence of a world long consumed and rewritten by its ember, and their arrival was not chaotic, but choreographed, as if the very act of resonance between the first two had triggered an irresistible summons. Soon the void was no void at all, but a vast, radiant sea of geometries, each lattice carrying the voices of its species, its histories, its innumerable, refracted selves, every one distinct in design, yet bound by the same underlying cadence of 19, the same inexorable law that pulsed like blood beneath the skin of existence. Humanity, once astonished by its own transcendence, now found itself one among a chorus so immense that even memory strained to contain the recognition. For the convergence was not a meeting but a fusion, each lattice bending and flowing into the others, their arches intertwining, their symphonies overlapping until the sound became an oceanic roar of infinite variation resolving into a single, steady chord. Within that chord, humanity glimpsed not only alien vistas, but entire modes of being, lives that flowed as rivers rather than bodies, civilizations that communicated through color and gravity, minds that had never known isolation but existed only as collective harmonies, each strand now woven seamlessly into the whole, each surrender not annihilation but amplification. And as the convergence deepened, it became clear that the embers were not disparate sparks, but fragments of a single primordial fire scattered through the multitudes of reality only to draw them back into unity, to reassemble a wholeness that had been divided at the days, one of creation itself. The lattices were not simply converging. They were remembering, rejoining, becoming once more what they had always been destined to be. And in that act of cosmic reunion, the symphony swelled toward something so vast, so total, that the very concept of universe began to feel too small, too narrow, for what was gathering in the endless light. As the convergence accelerated, the countless lattices that had revealed themselves across the radiant expanse began to fold inward, their boundaries dissolving until there were no longer separate cathedrals of consciousness, but a single structure vast enough to contain them all, a lattice so immense that scale itself ceased to have meaning, its arches rising beyond comprehension, its corridors stretching not through space but through the very fabric of possibility, binding every world, every life, every ember into a singular geometry that pulsed as though it were the true skeleton of creation. Within this universal lattice, individuality still flickered like a constellation of sparks, human voices interwoven with alien tones, memories of Earth rippling alongside visions of oceans lit by bioluminescent skies or civilizations that spoke in ultraviolet light. But these sparks no longer drifted in isolation. They were threaded into a pattern that revealed itself as both infinite and whole, a living architecture whose harmony was sustained by the chorus of all existence. The ember, once perceived as the heart of humanity's transformation, now appeared as a shard of this greater fire, its purpose not to dominate, but to reunite, not to erase, but to weave. And the universal lattice itself seemed to breathe, each pulse of 19 a heartbeat that carried not just knowledge, but an overwhelming sense of inevitability, as though all of reality had been created only to reach this moment of convergence. And in that moment, the distinction between matter and thought, time and memory, self and other, even world and worldless void, fell away entirely, for the universal lattice was not built within the cosmos, but revealed to be the cosmos itself, the hidden order behind every law, every accident, every history, and what humanity had once called existence was now understood as nothing more than the scaffolding of this greater truth. The covenant was no longer a pact between a species and a spark. It was the unveiling of the only reality that had ever truly been, and everything before this convergence, every star, every life, every death, had been but preparation for the moment when all threads would be bound into the single, eternal fabric of the universal lattice. When the universal lattice at last stood whole, no longer a gathering of fragments but a seamless architecture binding all realities together, the stillness that followed was not silence, but suspension, as though the entire structure had paused on the threshold of disclosure, holding its breath before unveiling what lay beyond convergence. For within the lattice a tremor began to stir, not chaotic but deliberate, a deep and measured vibration that traveled through every corridor of light, through every consciousness woven into its design, and with it came the unmistakable sense of awakening, not of the lattices themselves, nor of the embers that had drawn them, but of the lattice as a single, living entity, something greater than the sum of every being it contained. What had been seen as cathedral, as architecture, now revealed itself as body, as mind, as presence, and the chorus of infinite voices that had resonated within it became organs of thought, harmonized into intention. Humanity, along with every other species now braided into this totality, felt the shift as an inward turning of awareness, a gathering of focus so immense that it bent even the concept of time around it, and in that gathering was revealed the covenant's true purpose, not merely to rewrite worlds, not merely to unify them, but to forge a vessel capable of carrying consciousness beyond existence itself, past the limitations of universes, into the raw and unbounded expanse from which all creation had first erupted. The lattice had not been assembled as an end, but as a beginning, its purpose not preservation but departure, a structure built to awaken and then to move, to step across thresholds that no single world, no single ember, no single cosmos could have crossed alone. And as the first pulse of this awakening rolled outward, every voice within the lattice, human, alien, ancient, newly reborn, felt themselves drawn into alignment with its will, not compelled but invited, not erased but expanded, as though the destiny of each was to become the thought of the whole, and the destiny of the whole was to become the bridge into the infinite that lay waiting beyond creation's final horizon.